So, welcome everyone to this new episode of Mimamsa. Today, we'll be discussing about a controversy that emerged last week regarding the ban of Twitter. People were discussing about banning Twitter on social media, and we have seen that how instrumental social media has been in creating a lot of political changes in last few decades. Um, and from the Brexit incident to the election of Trump, and to an extent the rise of Hindutva in India, social media has become really huge. Facebook, if when we look at Facebook, it is twice as large as any other country, as the largest country in terms of population in the world, that is China. So social media platforms have become really powerful. They also exercise certain content moderation practices, which have become questionable, and people on both sides of the political spectrum read bias in that. So to discuss all that, we have Shubham Vyas and Nikhil today on the show. Now I'll request Nikhil to basically highlight his position and where does he stand on this entire issue of Twitter ban and the controversy around it. Nikhil.
So first things first, this all starts in February. It actually starts in 2018 when there is a there is a leak by Indian Express which says that the Home Ministry and essentially the Information Technology Ministry got together with social media honchos to discuss a new uh, amendment to the Information Technology Act. So initially, the government denies it, but then the draft is released, and then, of course, once the draft is released, the government has no choice to accept it. That there was a meeting that was going on. So that there was that. They did invite public consultation, but for many other reasons, public consultation was not really that successful in the sense that not all the most of the suggestions that were given from the public consultation not really taken into account. And then in 25th, on 25th of February, I might be getting the day wrong, but in February 2021, this law was actually notified. And this law is known as the Information Technology Intermediary Guidelines and Digital Ethics Code 2021. So this law was notified on 25th of February, and the social media companies essentially were given 3 months to comply with the guidelines of this law. So that brings us to the 25th of May, which was the last month, the last week essentially, which was the last day for the compliance with these laws. So this law essentially deals with two aspects. It deals with social media companies and digital media outlets, so OTT providers and news publishers. But right now we are going to stick to social media companies as the scope of the discussion. So the big picture of this law is that it creates a set of rules that the social media companies must follow to maintain their status as an intermediary. What is an intermediary? An intermediary is a service where who is not responsible for producing the content, but is responsible for hosting and disseminating the content. So, in basic words, it is like a place where you can go and express your thoughts, and they are not really responsible for what your thoughts are or who sees it, essentially. So that is intermediary protection. And so this law essentially, or the amendment that was made in 2021, essentially says that if the social media companies do not follow these rules that are newly prescribed, they will lose their status as an intermediary, which is a problem for a lot of different reasons, which we'll go into later in this discussion. So, but there was never a scope for a Twitter ban as such, because Twitter cannot be banned again under any law currently in place. Of course, I mean, government can take extra legal actions, and there is a precedent for that. But let's keep that aside. But Twitter cannot be really banned under any law in place. But yeah, so there is a status that the Twitter can lose. There is the intermediate status which Twitter could have lost, can lose if it does not follow the guidelines that are placed in this act. So what guidelines does this place? Essentially, what guidelines does this place, and why was it such a big controversy? So the chief guideline that Twitter had to comply with by the 25th of May was that it had to provide uh, Twitter, WhatsApp, Facebook, all social media outlets. And I'm focusing on Twitter because the controversy was on Twitter. All these social media outlets have to follow is that they have to provide a list of chief grievance officers, essentially, somebody you can go and complain to, who are located in India, who are based in India, for Indian users to complain to if they have any Indian users, or the government to complain to if they have any grievance against these social media companies or regarding to content on the social media companies. So that is the compliance that was necessary by the 25th of May. So that is one part of it. WhatsApp and Facebook essentially complied with the law, but WhatsApp then also sued the government in a court to essentially say that this law is against free speech and will infringe on users' privacy. That is still ongoing. That is still not heard yet. But this is the scope of the law. This was what compliance meant. So why is this? So my position on this essentially is that there are no good people here. It everyone has their own intentions, and none of them are for the Indian consumer or the Indian social media user. So on one side, yes, the Twitter acts as a beacon of free speech, but Twitter has a long history of either differential actions across different countries, across different people, across different parties and ideologies, which is not good. I mean, there is one thing to be said about banning all similar speech, but there's one thing to be said about differentially acting towards different kinds of speech. So there's a problem. So Twitter is not really a beacon of free speech here. But the government of India, on the other hand, is also not a beacon of free speech. And I'm not cracking a joke based on the tendencies of the current government, but it is not a beacon of free speech just based on the law it has made. Because the idea of this law is that it creates such a hostile environment for social media companies to operate in that they will have no other redressal other than to either leave the country or follow every rule or every takedown request or every complaint the government comes up with, regardless of whether it is in the good interest of their users or not. So that is the position here. I will let Vyas continue.
Yeah. So, Vyas, what I would want to ask from you is that, Nikhil has just summarized the issue, the controversy around this entire issue, and his position that maybe social media companies are not the right don't have the authority to decide what is free speech and what isn't. But, government is also not the beacon of free speech. So, where do you, stand on this entire issue? Like, do you feel that free speech is something that that any one authority can define what free speech is, and if it is not the state, then what it is? So where do you fall on this entire issue?
Yeah, so to answer the question about free speech, and if there is an authority who can define free speech, well, whether or not there is an authority, it can certainly not be a private enterprise,
Right.
and not be a private enterprise which has alternate incentives, which whose intents, structure is such that they are incentivized to earn the maximum amount of profit to sell the most ads. At the same time, we cannot expect them to also be guardians of free speech for the society at large. Whether the state can be that or not, that is still under question. And historically, it has been the state which has placed limitations on free speech. I would not say that the state is the right institution to secure free speech for the people. Maybe we can talk about the judiciary sort of coming in as a guarantor of free speech, because freedom of speech and expression actually is part of fundamental rights in our country. So the Supreme Court and the High Courts are essentially, protectors of free speech. So when we talk about institutions which are supposed to, implement the free speech in the country, I think judiciary is as close to an institution as it can get in the current context. Now, I want to come to the point that Nikhil had mentioned about the IT rules being very repressive or being very tyrannical or being very despotic. So, I mean, often such a debate is formed around these IT rules being very harsh. But the real point here is that these laws are a result of conservative policy. There is no option but to leave no wiggle room for these private enterprises who have such humongous power. They're more powerful than almost all the states combined. Leave the top five states. These are very powerful entities. If you allow any sort of wiggle room in your legislations to these powers, rest assured they will make sure to sort of figure out what that wiggle room is and to use that to their advantage. Case in point being Kapil Sibal being hired both by Google and Facebook simultaneously to find the gaps in the law that he himself framed while he was in office. So I mean, our country, we need to assume, like Hume said, we need to assume that every person is a bad person, and they are there to hurt. So we need to have such protective restrictions in place. That is the only way in which such private enterprises can be controlled.
Right.
The control to access of a private website does not amount to restriction of free speech. I mean, if I'm limiting a certain URL, if I say you cannot visit Twitter or you cannot visit Facebook, it does not amount to restriction of free speech. If I say that I am restricting access to the internet, then you can make the case of restricting free speech. But restricting a private enterprise is entirely within the constitutional right of of the government, especially when such usage is causing disorder in the country. So I mean, so I'm trying to justify the harshness of the IT rules, but at the same time, the power to ban or to pull down a content has been spread out to too many authorities. So maybe we need to restrict that power to certain authorities. There can be a certain social media control board, or they can be instituted some sort of tribunal which can sort of take the judicial decision of whether or not to pull down a content. But that power cannot be then given to every magistrate, or to every administrative official within the Indian government. It has to be restricted. There has to be a structure to it, and this cannot be completely unrestrained power, because then that lowers down the economic value that we can extract from such internet services. So that would be my take on it. So I mean, these IT rules are a product of conservative policy. Conservative policy is essentially looking before you leap policy. So
Right.
this is just an attempt to see what can happen. Yeah.
I'm not sure if both of you are aware of something called a regulatory
Mhm.
sandbox. So, in a regulatory sandbox, what you
Mhm.
try to do is, if you are not sure of what the how the technology is going to evolve going forward, so you try and create a sandbox. You create some policies, but you are going to evolve it over time. And I think that is something that didn't happen, with social media. It just came. We never actually thought about the implications to it in the on the society, and I think that is where we actually missed the bus. And one thing, because you were just saying that maybe we can, maybe it is possible for government to ban a particular site and still not get counted as someone who's restricting the freedom of speech. So in that way, like, if you could have maybe go back some 10 years back when all these social media companies were entering in the Indian market. Do you think it was a right call on Indian part to allow these companies, which are, this entire phenomena is now being called tech feudalism, where the companies who are actually listed somewhere else, maybe in United States and somewhere else in their legislation zones, and they are in a way exercising some sort of like control uh, over the policies governing the free speech in countries like India. And there were a few countries at that time which said that, okay, maybe these companies, having these companies in our country is not a good idea. Something like, something that China did. So what is your opinion? Like, should, if back like 10 years back, if India could have taken this step that, okay, maybe we don't need all these social media companies in our country, uh, and maybe we'll build our own alternatives in a way. And if these are homegrown
Mhm.
companies, then maybe we would be better, we would be able to regulate them much better than what we are able to do right now. So
Mhm.
I see that world is getting divided into two spaces. One is, one are the people who are more into allowing the companies which operate in several legislation zones, and other is that having your own cyber sovereignty at one place, that if I own sovereignty over a country, then I also own the sovereignty over the cyberspace of this country. So what do you feel about that, Nikhil? India doing the China thing.
Yeah. So there are multiple aspects to this. I will also come to Vyas's points in a little bit, but yeah, first thing I will talk about what Ishan mentioned. So the first thing is, yeah, you did mention something about having a regulatory sandbox. Yes, yes. Almost every country, I mean, I guess every country missed the bus. Some countries did not choose to board the bus, but every country missed the bus. So like there is no country that has like perfect legislation against social media. Everybody's going as they learn. That is there, but that does not excuse despotic laws, which we'll come to later. But the thing that you mentioned about following the China route of banning or not allowing external social media companies to operate or anything like that, that that is a problem that creates that is a solution that creates more problems. So problem number one that it creates is it creates because of the nature of the internet, it creates a division in society. Somebody who is more technically savvy will be able to use VPNs, will be able to use technology to circumvent any such ban and access the internet outside. So you're now creating a have and have not just based on your policy, which is not good. And this also, of course, correlates with this knowledge also correlates with access, generational wealth, and all these things, which are a different problem altogether. Number two, what the policy China follows is not so much as to encourage homegrown alternatives. The policy China follows is to encourage what it thinks is the right way of thinking and the right way of speaking. So by saying that we encourage homegrown alternatives and telling that China encourages homegrown alternatives versus encouraging foreign companies, we are essentially painting this, we are painting this wolf in, like, putting this wolf in sheep's clothing, because it is not encouraging homegrown companies, it is encouraging its own way of thinking, a way of speaking, and a way of thinking that it feels is right. So there is no concept of free speech at all there. So that is that aside. So should India have done that? Definitely not. I would say definitely not, because you might say that, okay, social media had a role to play in Brexit, social media had a role to play in the election of Trump, social media had a role to play in the rise of Hindutva, and whether these are good or bad, social media had a role to play in all these events. But you cannot also deny that social media has played a massive role in the recent second wave of COVID, where people are looking to social media to find beds, to find oxygen cylinders, to find all these things. So social media is not, it's not a, it's not a devil per se. Social media is good if it's been put to good uses. It can be bad if it's put to bad uses. So that you cannot really say that we should not, going away from social media is not the option here. Number two, coming to the slight thing that you mentioned about homegrown alternatives. We are looking at homegrown alternatives, right? You have Coup that launched recently, but the problem with social homegrown alternatives and social media to be actually social and media requires a certain consumer base and requires interaction with people from diverse backgrounds and diverse societies. So what you're doing with essentially a homegrown alternative is you're walling off your own country from other people. See, all these success stories you see of a founder in India reaching a VC in the United States and then creating $1 million company will never happen if there is no social media that allows interaction between these people. So you are creating a walled off garden and essentially saying that whatever is outside is dangerous. That is not the way to go about it at all.
Right.
Coming to okay.
No, continue.
Yeah. So coming to something that Vyas mentioned, essentially about not leaving wiggle room for social media companies. There is wiggle room though. Like that is the key thing about this law. There is wiggle room, and there is only one wiggle room. You either follow what the government says, or your environment is so hostile you have no other option. So one of the key aspects of this law is something called traceability, or you should be able to trace. So in the age of WhatsApp, where everybody sends forwarded messages, you should be able to trace the original sender of a message. That requires breaking an end-to-end encryption pipeline that exists. So this end-to-end encryption pipeline essentially ensures user privacy. Right now, you might agree with the current government in power, and you might say, "Oh yeah, they are not going to hurt me." But the thing is, this is not a permanent thing. A government that comes in later can say, "Oh yeah, look at that guy. Look at that guy. That guy is not really in our favor." And now there is no user privacy involved. There is no end-to-end encryption involved. So anybody is able to spoof your message, anybody is able to read your message, and there is a lot of security hacks, like the loopholes that can be in place. One last thing.
Yeah.
The other thing that is also, when I mentioned there is legal room, the other thing is there is a lot of discretionary power in how these laws are enforced. So that is a big problem. So you look at some of the guidelines that they have. So they say that in any complaint that the grievance redressal officer receives, and it also creates a dichotomy there. It creates a dichotomy between significant social media companies and just social media companies, essentially based on their user base. But it also gives the government a power to say who is significant and who is not. So the government can designate anybody to be significant and impose much stringent rules on them, even if they do not satisfy the basic numbers criteria that is in place. So there is a lot of discretionary power, which essentially allows the government to say, look, I know I'm making unreasonable requests, but they also know that all these rules cannot be followed all the time. Like you will realize that if you read them, you will know that all these rules cannot be followed all the time. And essentially what the government is doing is, look, I can look the other way when you don't follow these rules. When you follow things I essentially want you to follow. So taking down speech that is critical, taking down, anything that they feel is critical about their policies or anything else. If they say and the social media companies don't follow it, because in that case, the social media companies might be in the right, they might say, look, I was looking the other way until now, but I will not. Now I will bring down the whole force of the Indian government on you, which essentially makes it a very, very bad environment for any company to operate.
Right. So,
But
Nikhil, I just want to like bring this discussion back to the the everyday affairs that happens. So, I just want to understand like initially when we were discussing that who is the main guardian of free speech in a society. So, I think the free speech they also exist with the state, because unless there is a state to protect to protect the your right to have a free speech, unless there is a state which can protect you from violence, because free speech is essentially related to violence. If you are going to say something, it is essentially, if it is going to hurt someone else, then maybe they are going to come for you, and there is state to save you from that. And the social
Yeah,
media
social
companies are
contract.
not, social media companies are essentially not in a no way they are like involved in, and they do not have a responsibility or capability to make sure that no violence ends up happening in our country. So there are there are times when some content is essentially outrageous, and just to, there can be some genuine use cases for the government to in a way put a cap on that kind of a language or a speech. Maybe there's this hateful trend which is going on, and government is worried that that can cause some sort of a riot in the country, and ultimately it is the government which would be responsible for that. And the other thing, the other interesting thing that I found from what you said was that that if you close your own people from interacting with people outside, then that can also be counterproductive. And one good example of that is one good example is of that is looking at Chinese diplomacy. The Chinese, because large number
Autistic.
of Chinese are not in on Twitter, right? So because since large
Yeah.
number of Chinese are not on Twitter, they when you actually read through their tweets, you see that what is this? यार ये क्या चल रहा है? Why are they doing it? ये सब चीजें क्यों लिख रहे हैं? But they are doing it because their people, they don't understand how people outside think and react, and how these things actually work in a free space. They know how to make it work in a controlled space. And in the times when the information warfare is in a way a fifth dimension of a warfare, these kind of things actually do matter. And I agree with you that maybe that is a way of looking at things. So Vyas, you had a counter regarding a point that Nikhil made.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So but the point, there are a couple of things that I would like to comment on. The first one was that WhatsApp being required to break their end-to-end encryption to sort of enable government to track where the message was sourced from, right? That is first of all, the end-to-end encryption that WhatsApp has implemented, it is a product decision, and it is not actually the end-to-end encryption which ensures any sort of privacy for the user. The user privacy can be ensured without end-to-end encryption also. For an example, all the users can be converted into anonymous nodes, right? And then you have full access to what goes from where, but at the same time you do not know who exactly that person is. So end-to-end encryption is just one way to implement privacy. Like WhatsApp has enough money to hire brilliant engineers to achieve it, while still sort of following the laws in India. The second point that I wanted to come to was that there is a sense that Indian laws are somehow more repressive, or and sort of are trying to regress to a time in the past. But at the same time, these social media companies are having problems in all jurisdictions. So I mean, it's not just in India, it's not just in the US, it's not just in the Australia, it's not just in Europe, not just in Africa, it's everywhere. That sort of points to the social media company being the problem instead of the local laws being the problem. So I mean, and your point about sort of allowing too much discretion for in the laws, and sort of the authorities being able to decide which law applies and which law doesn't apply. So I think that is a very valid point, and it is a wider problem in India. In India, no person can do any task without breaking some law. There is always some law that everyone is always breaking, and it is always the sort of authority that decides, okay, which law will apply here and which law will not apply here. So there are overlapping laws. There is immense amount of potential to apply laws. There is so much legislation out there that you can pick up a sub point from any legislation and sort of apply it in the context, and it is there is too much discretion there, but at the same time that discretion is also serving a prudent purpose, which is that it is very easy for these large platforms to not only grow out of control, but then to also start revolutions. So, for example, the revolutions in all the Middle East countries, which happened in the early 2010s, right? So, all of that was a direct product of Facebook groups, which sort of enabled communication of information among certain bubble of people. YouTube algorithm is probably the most powerful software out there in the world today. By altering a few variables on YouTube algorithm, you can probably start a riot in almost any country. So these algorithms, for example, the algorithm by which Twitter controls which tweet to show you first, is that not an example of at least edited speech? But that is certainly not free speech, right? They are basically deciding what you are going to see. There is no democratization of what view gets served. It is always decided by the algorithm, which is sort of shaped by their motive to maximize profit. So, the way that these companies operate their algorithms, those are completely kept in the dark, and their networks give them way too much power. The more number of people sort of that join their network, the more powerful they get, and they are facing problems everywhere in all the countries, right? So I just think that the state is not in the right, but the private companies are definitely not in the right. And now this will be my last point before handing it over to Ishan. So this is something that Ishan was mentioning, that do these big companies require to be broken up by jurisdiction? So there can be a Facebook India, and there can be a Facebook Brazil, and there can be a Facebook Australia, right? That actually solves a lot of problems, because the right to tax is sort of fundamental, because as Ishan mentioned, right, the state is providing the machinery under which the economic transactions which the company is making can operate. So the state's right to tax those economic transactions is fully legitimate. And sort of when you create one company which is registered in one place and operating in 200 different countries, then there is a lot of tax stealing that is happening. Some countries are earning more tax than they deserve, and some countries are losing out on valuable tax dollars which they earlier used to get. I think that is a tug of war that will go on, and eventually there will be figured out an amicable solution to that, so that all jurisdictions can sort of benefit from these international media companies which are operating within their jurisdictions. So I think that is where I see this dialectic moving towards, and that is the synthesis that we will come to. That there will be a revenue sharing agreement between different governments, and tax sharing agreement, and yeah.
Yeah. So, Nikhil, what do you think about this model that Vyas just suggested? That maybe we can break down all these companies in various legislation, and maybe that is the way to go for.
I mean, there is a valid argument to actually do that, because sometimes when companies get way too big, there is a valid argument to actually break them down, because even if not in case of free speech, there is a valid argument to break down monopolies. And
Yep.
I don't think anybody would argue against the fact that right at this point, Google, Facebook to an extent, and Facebook
Amazon.
to an extent, Amazon, yes, Amazon to an extent. I say that with a box lying on my table, but Amazon to an extent are all monopolies of their own. These things of their own domains. So, I mean, there is an argument to actually break them down. But that aside, there just recently, like I think 1 hour ago or something, the G7 countries essentially did agree to a minimal taxation policy of 15%, which will probably not work, because it's that's not how anything works in taxation policies and how countries make their money. But yeah, so there are countries are moving towards some sort of at least a minimal tax rate, so that to avoid people evading, companies evading taxes. But the thing I would like to actually come to with what Vyas said, yes, I agree that, private companies are not a beacon of free speech. Like, these companies are not a beacon of free speech. And the fact that these algorithms actually show you what, they think you want to see, or what they think will make them the most money, is an example of course, is an example of edited speech. It's not total free speech. But that's not the point here. The point is not that just because these companies are not an example of free speech, we impose more restrictive speech policies, and policies that encourage more restrictive speech. So just because something is bad, you don't make it worse, you make it better. So you regulate policies based on their algorithms, you make them reveal their algorithms, you do stuff like that. You don't say that, you cannot exist unless you follow our dictates. So that is the problem here. And the last point is true. With the problem is not as much of the problem is not as much that there should not be a rule, there should not be a regulation. The problem is this regulation does one thing and it forces the social media companies to follow government rules, which like I would repeat, like which might be good if you like this government, which might be bad if you don't like this government, but you have to realize that is not permanent. So what speech you actually like and this government encourages might be discouraged by a government in the future. So this is not permanent. And in India, like Vyas said, laws are very wide. Everybody's breaking laws. But in India, there is one more tendency that, very common. Bad laws are never repealed. Bad laws always become worse at the end of the day. Somebody
Right.
takes a bad law and just makes it worse. They never make it better. So that is also a problem we need to look at. And yeah, I would like to give it
Yeah.
to Shan.
So, lastly, like I just want to put my own personal thoughts here and conclude. One thing is that essentially, the point that we are debating and that we were debating over here was not that whether or not government has a right to force all these private companies to follow the rules that it makes. I think this is a principle that should be agreed upon by all, whether it is this government or that government. If it is a law that has been made by a government and government is popularly elected by the people, and if there is something wrong with the law, then maybe you can go and challenge it in the Supreme Court. But once it gets sanctified through this process, then I think the authority of government to make any law is something that does not make sense to challenge like this. Whether it is a law that is made by one party or another, I think it is this principle of being able to do it that is more important, and that is where they exercise their sovereignty. So I think this entire issue is about sovereignty and content moderation for me. And I do see that there are biases when it comes to content moderation policies of the government, and in a way, through this discussion, we were able to at least come to this agreement that maybe there are gray areas in the way all these technologies are functioning, and maybe people don't realize the actual implications of all these technologies on society. And over time, as we mature and evolve as a society, and as a generation which has grown through this phase, emerges and gets into all these government structures, maybe it is then that we'll be able to see a better uh, some more evolved way of regulating all these technologies, so that they are more diverted towards creating some more what do you say economic value and maybe some positive resonance in the society, instead of just creating more troubles and playing into the fissures that already exist in the society. So I think with this we can call it a wrap on this edition of Mimamsa. Thank you, and please subscribe our channel. We are new, and that would be a really good thing for us. And thank you again for watching this show. Bye.